many others, okay, which I could detail, but don't have the time. A full account of World War II black military revolts, however, is yet to be told. But as far as I know from what I've read, I'd estimate there were at least a couple of hundred. The story of the Vietnam Revolt, okay. I skip a lot here. Okay. The Vietnam U.S. military revolt was probably the most devastating in U.S. military history. There were three groups responsible for the defeat of the U.S. in Vietnam: the liberation struggle of Vietnamese, the U.S. civilian anti-war movement, and the U.S. military and veterans anti-war movement. Among the last two, it was the military and veterans revolt which was the most strategically significant. And I could quote Nixon on saying this, who was upset about the civilian movement, but he said what really decided on not sending troops in was that they couldn't be reliable, and so he wouldn't send any more troops back into Vietnam. And one Marine officer described it, quote, "Our army that now remains in Vietnam is in a state approaching collapse, with individual units avoiding or having refused combat, murdering their officers and non-commissioned officers, drug-ridden, dispirited, or not near mutinous. Conditions exist among armed forces in Vietnam which have only been exceeded in this century by the collapse of the Tsarist armies in 1916 and 1917. The morale, discipline, and battle worthiness are lower and worse than at any time in this century and possibly in the history of the United States."
Who are you quoting there?
Who am I quoting there?
Is that what you were doing, quoting some book?
Yes.
Yeah.
You want to know who?
Yeah.
Colonel Robert Heinel. Okay, this was from an article he wrote called "The Collapse of the Armed Forces," was written in the Armed Forces Journal in June of 1971.
Okay.
Reprinted many places. The whole article is extremely interesting.
Yeah.
Now, just a bit about the American troops, who they were. Of course, the draft existed during the Vietnam War, and this was a factor that led to the anti-war protest among predominantly petty bourgeois and bourgeois university students. Between 1964 and 1973, 27 million men were draftable. 40% of them were inducted into the military. Overwhelmingly, they were working class or farm youth or members of minorities with an average age of 19. 80% had a secondary education or less. College graduates were only 2% of draftees. Let's see if I have more here on that. Okay. Just mention one more thing that, in relationship to draftees. The majority of those who were in Vietnam were not draftees, but they were volunteers, okay, which is, some people still to this day tell me that the reason why that there was such a revolt was because there were draftees, and that's not true. Okay, the majority of those who revolted in Vietnam were people who were volunteered to go in.
But were their demographics different in terms of education and so on?
No.
Same as the
No.
draftees?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Do you know about what percentage that would be
What percentage of what?
of were draftees compared to the ones that volunteered? I mean, was it like 50-50 or was it like, you know,
Yeah.
just curious because I thought it was
Yeah.
draftees were the problem too. Quote unquote problem.
Let me see. No, I don't exactly have the exact percent. The only percent that I have that I mentioned here, the 10% of the draft of all draftees went to Vietnam. The others went to other deployments around the world.
Oh.
What percentage evaded the war?
What percentage evaded the war? You know, I think let's say I think I have that somewhere, but I don't. I don't have that exactly. No.
Estimates are good.
You can get it if you really are interested by looking at Soldiers in Revolt by David Courtwright, which is the most extensive in terms of data on the revolt in Vietnam.
Al, let me just mention something. I love this. This isn't my history right now. You're running my life when I was getting out of high school and getting drafted and everything. But there's probably, no matter whose data you read, you're not going to find this, and that is what happened to me, and I think it happened to a lot of people. I don't know if it's 1% or 50, 20, or whatever, but I got a draft notice in...
Could we save that to the end of?
all I'm saying
that's
is,
more in discussion line.
let me say one thing. You could join because you were drafted. I did.
Right.
In other words, I was drafted in 65, told to show up in January 66. But to avoid the draft and be sent in the infantry and sent to Vietnam or whatever, wherever it would have been sent, I joined and became a dental assistant and medic. And that way I had some control. I paid an extra year. I was I joined, I didn't draft, but I did it consciously. So, and I was lucky. I got sent to Germany. Once you sign, they can do anything they want with you, no matter what. And the nastier you get, the nastier they get, real fast. So, just saying, some of the stuff's going to fall through.
You're cutting into my time now, because I'm
Sorry.
limited
Thank you.
to another 2 hours. So, okay. All right.
I'm ready to go.
Let me mention something about the anti-war movement then. In the early to mid-60s, the anti-war movement, reflecting its largely petty bourgeois composition, mainly ignored the military and concentrated on draft resistance and protests against the war. 5 Marxist political organizations did involve themselves with organizing within the military. These organizations were the Socialist Workers' Party, Young Socialist Alliance, the Youth Against War and Fascism, which was initiated by the Workers' World Party, Progressive Labor Party, Revolutionary Union, which of course became the Revolutionary Communist Party, and Progressive Labor Party. Oh, I should say, and the Spartacus League. The Communist Party, with one exception, just concentrated on draft resistance. These organizations involved themselves in organizing when their members were drafted, and that's when they started to work among their fellow soldiers. But the anti-war movement among the military, both in and out of Vietnam, was originated by the soldiers themselves as early as 1965. It increased its momentum in 1968 after the Tet Offensive and reached its height in the 1969 to 1972 period. It was only only in 1967 that a handful of civilian anti-war activists began organizing a coffee house near a military base for soldiers to congregate for discussion, which started, of course, the coffee house movement, which spread to at least 26 bases around the world by 1971. Another phenomenon, of course, was newspapers published by the anti-war military. Starting in 1967, they mushroomed worldwide to about 300 on bases, ships, and battlefields. During the Vietnam War, desertions reached 500,000, with thousands of military personnel escaping to other countries, and a handful, and I do mean only a handful, even joining the National Liberation Front. At least 15,000 military received conscientious objector status, and an overall average of 26% got punitive discharges for active or passive resistance. By 1971, drug use had affected 62% of the military, with those in Vietnam reaching 79%. In 1969, there were 68 recorded outright refusals to fight, that is, mutinies, at the platoon, company, or battalion levels. In 1970, in one combat division, there were 35 mutinies that were recorded. And if you extended it to similar units, that would have meant hundreds of similar revolts. And that doesn't take into consideration combat avoidance, in quotes. That is, secretly refusing to fight while on patrols. That probably numbered in the thousands. And that was probably due to the National Liberation Front announcing that they would not fire on Americans who displayed peace symbols on their clothing or helmets. A final indication of resistance was fragging, or attempts to kill unpopular officers or NCOs with hand grenades. Between 1969 and 1971, 730 fraggings were officially documented, resulting in 85 deaths and hundreds wounded. Some officials estimate that this represents only 10% of the fraggings for the entire war. If we add this to the number of officers who were shot in the back by their men during battle, which were oftentimes called friendly fire, then approximately 20 to 25% of the officers were killed by their own enlisted men. I mean, killed deliberately. The most comprehensive Army study of military insurgents shows that 55% of all soldiers were involved in resistance activities, all right, 55%. And that does not include those in the Marines, Navy, and Air Force. As Courtright concluded, ultimately the war lost the support and cooperation of its own troops. It took until the mid-1980s and the creation of an all-volunteer army, which had set up alarm bells, the all-volunteer army, for the military to again become a reliable institution of the capitalist state. From the war's end in, when the U.S. left? 75, did they leave? Yeah, okay. The war's end in 75 until the mid-80s. Resistance activities, though diminishing, still continued. For example, there were attempts to form GI unions, culminating in a drive by the Enlisted People's Organizing Committee and the American Federation of Government Employees Union, but this was halted by the Congressional Act of 1977, which forbade unions in the military, which is why the U.S. doesn't have military unions compared to many European countries, as well as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. However, on some bases, elected enlisted men's councils were established. I could go into that more, but That is also a very unknown story. Cartwright wrote a second book called Left Face, which he detailed a lot of stuff about military resistance during that period of the 60s through the 80s in countries all over the world. And he spoke a lot about the relatively unknown resistance movements in the post-Vietnam War period in the United States. What the anti-Vietnam War movement demonstrates is that although the civilian anti-war segment did not approach the military until later in the war, and even played a supportive secondary role, the enlisted military was able to organize itself into a decisive anti-war element. Many in the civilian anti-war movement concluded it was a mistake not to relate to the military from the beginning, and that in future wars they would remedy that approach. From a revolutionary Marxist viewpoint, the military anti-war insurgency shared all the political contradictions of the wider New Left movement. But it did embody Engels' perspective on the role of politically conscious working class army and its role as a worker in uniform at the point of production of war. Now I want to jump again, and this is to Iraq. Out of the Vietnam War came certain military groups, such as Vietnam Vets Against the War, and the Veterans for Peace. And subsequently, during the Iraq War, the Iraq Veterans Against the War. While these organizations were actively opposing the Iraq War even before it began, the remainder of the anti-war movement was slower to directly relate to the military, even though faster than in the Vietnam War. The initial impetus, actually, of the civilian anti-war movement came from families of those in the military, such groups as the Gold Star Families for Peace, Military Families Speak Out, which had a membership of about 3,000 families. These groups, together with the veterans and soldiers groups, organized demonstrations at military bases, put anti-war advertisements in military publications, and operated websites that solicited responses from U.S. soldiers in Iraq. Their inclusion in the anti-war coalition gained some positive results. For example, the United for Peace and Justice had at its first task, quote, working with troops to project a realistic picture of the war and to support the soldiers and families that are already dissenting and questioning U.S. occupation, unquote. I leave it to you to think about what their effectiveness was. Because of less military dissidence among troops compared to Vietnam, there have been few overt attempts to organize among them. At least one socialist organization, and I know of one other, but this is the most, how shall I say, the one that most actively has been involved, is the Progressive Labor Party, which has some cadre currently in the National Guard and in regular Army units, but not much is publicly known about them. Not revealing any secrets, because in their newspaper they have articles by, quote, red soldiers, unquote. And, okay. The U.S. Defense Department learned its lesson from military insurgents in the Vietnam War and hence made it difficult to organize in Iraq. Even though there were certain instances of dissent, such as a few cases that were recorded of mutiny and fragging. skipping over a lot of the Iraq stuff.
Well, we all know it, we all lived through it.
The anti-war movement in Iraq was largely focused on three aspects of military work. One was counter-recruitment. Second was support for GI resistors, such as, you remember, Lieutenant Watada. Third was organizing the National Guard and reservists. Since the draft was eliminated in '74, the purpose of draft resistance was to reduce the size of the recruiting pool, which did meet with some success, as measured by the fact that the military services have lost periodically, fallen short of their monthly recruitment goals since the beginning of 2005. I have also heard that from members of the Iraq Veterans Against the War complaints that their exposure has been more limited than warranted among much of the rest of the peace movement. The second approach was to the National Guard, another approach to the National Guard, it was partly based on the absence of the draft, which necessitated reliance on the National Guard and the reserves. They represented an average of 40% of the troops in Iraq, which was the highest percent that they had been involved in since World War II. Because they live in the community, they're more accessible to troops on a base. Demographically, they're older, more frequently married. They have civilian occupations and community commitments. Until now, their expectation for active combat duty has been minimal, and separation from family and the civilian life has caused major disruption and hardship for them and their families. Surveys that were done indicated that it was these troops and their families that were the ones that were most vocal in expressing dissatisfaction and demanding a return home from Iraq. Okay. Despite the evidence from the anti-war Vietnam troops and veterans, the current anti-war movement views are not theoretically informed. They are similar to arguing against workers organizing enterprise around specific issues because the workers might not care about the wider goals of the working class movement. It is the duty of the broader movement to demonstrate to the workers in uniform the links between the immediate struggle and the capitalist state and imperialist forces which are responsible for the conditions under which they find themselves. But at the same time, it must be recognized that workers in uniform are the key productive force in making war. And that is why they must be organized to impose imperialist war, not necessarily because they'll be won to broader related issues. Even though I've seen no conscious attempt to apply Engels' analysis about the role of the military to the anti-Iraq war movement, it is intuitively employed in a theoretically strategic and tactical haphazard way. But even this demonstrates its validity in practice. Now I'm going to close. And in closing, I'm going to make some suggestions, a couple of which I made in my previous talks. I won't go into detail, but some I will go into more detail. These are suggestions on those organizations that base themselves on a Marxist legacy. 1, send cadre into the military to organize. This would be a general proposition. Now, I'm not talking about specific conditions now and the weakness of the left and all that, but as a general, continuous proposition, it's existed from the Socialist parties, the Second International, down through the Bolsheviks, down through the Communist International, okay, to some extent during Vietnam, okay, and it's part of the Marxist legacy, and it's an absolutely necessary part of the Marxist project. I suggest that they, under present circumstances, that it should be targeted to those branches most likely to identify as citizen soldiers, namely the National Guard and the reservists. As a extra bonus, as Engels suggested, the people that do the organizing, if they're actually in the National Guard or reserves or whatever, will learn military skills which may be necessary in future struggles. Although veterans could be helpful in this regard. Secondly, they should hold demonstrations at National Guard armories and reserve training centers which are easily accessible in cities and suburbs. Left organizations should leaflet training sessions, attempt to build links with the troops, both in their military and civilian roles. If socialist organizations have members in these organizations, or in these particular military units, it should only add to the possibilities for coordinated organizing. And let me mention one quickie thing. You might think, gee, do I have to join the National Guard? The answer is no. You join the National Guard Auxiliary, which is a civilian support organization. There you'll associate with them, okay? You can pick up information about them and their activities, maybe very useful information. For example, National Guard units were sent to Honduras. That's all you got in the newspaper. Media says, National Guard unit, I think it was Indiana, sent to Honduras. That's all you find. Now, if you had some lefty folks as National Guard Auxiliary, you might find out a lot more information about what that National Guard unit is doing in Honduras and be able to, how should I say, spread it around the left. You also pick up certain military skills as a auxiliary member, both in intelligence as well as armed. All right, third, and I will not go into detail with this because I went last time. Under present conditions, the left should not push for the draft, but if it looks like the government will institute one, socialists should critique its class nature and offer its own alternatives. The alternative would be a universal, as opposed to selective service draft, which would take in all 18-year-olds for 2 years of national service, which would include both civilian and military activities. Okay, look at it. Go into that. Short of Engels' notion of an armed nation, which I think socialists should discuss anyway, I believe that this would be a check on imperialist ventures, at least an Iraq war scale. Fourth, individually or collectively, socialists should consider legal weapons acquisition and training and learning the rudiments of military strategy and tactics. The working class needs to form, quote, our own clubs, such as existed among Boston workers. They could also acquire such skills by joining reenactment groups that simulate World War II and Vietnam War battles. I know it's tricky, but at the very least, we should, in the tradition of Engels and his Marxist military successors, study war to end war. Because if we prematurely study war no more, we're liable to be the victims of its perpetuators. And the idea of learning the weapons use, not just learning how to target shoot, but learning to use it in a tactical way, already exists in the red rifles Pink Pistols, John Brown gun clubs, the redneck revolutionaries, and I'd also suggest forming hacker groups. Okay, because in the modern sense, it's not just your weapon is not just a gun, but it's also something that you all carry. You all have a weapon on you, all of you, except for me. I don't. Okay, I have a flip phone. Okay. And I won't tell you why, but there is a definite reason why. But
You have a what?
flip phone,
What are they?
not an iPhone.
What are they?
What's a flip phone? I know I'm very 20th century on technology. One of these.
Oh my God, what is that?
The new smartphones are going to be flip phones, I think.
Okay? But you all have a personal computer or a laptop at home. All right? These can be used, all right, as weapons. They can be, my 15-year-old grandson could probably hack into the Pentagon. But, these can be used for intelligence gathering. It can be used for disseminating information to civilians. It can be used for disseminating information to the military. There are many publications of the military online or publications that vets read. And some of them are conservative, but if you look at the comments to them, they're very, very left, a lot of the comments by readers. I won't say what else you could use the military, you could use your computer for, but let's say there is hacking and then there's serious hacking, right? And the military uses hacking. All major military has either used hacking or prepared for hacking to do things like shut down electrical grids, cause dams to overflow, right? Well, and other things like that. I mean, you just read the stuff they do and think about how you can apply it, except in a different way.
Communication.
I have to go. I'm sorry. Thank you very much.
Oh, sure. Thanks for coming.
Take care, Dick.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so I want to emphasize that we must study, or I should say master all forms of struggle, and when to appropriately use each. Although the military aspect may be a very small niche among all these forms, it's to be neglected at our own risk. Whatever socialists decide to do, they should surely pick up the legacy of Engels and start thinking creatively about military and war within the context of the capitalist state, rather than thinking like bourgeois or petty bourgeois pacifists. And I say petty bourgeois pacifists both as a swear word and as a political label. That's it.
All right. Woo.
Okay, thank